Mayor Gillingham and Winnipeg City Councillors, my name is Teresa Longobardi. I'm a professor, health economics researcher, and doctoral research educator. I'm speaking to you today because I'm concerned for the safety of Winnipeg's children that use the public libraries. Intent on expressing my concerns to the library board, I sat in on 2 meetings last year. I learned from the board that I must speak to you about my concerns. My ask is this: that children's books in the Winnipeg Library System that display sexually explicit images, instruct on sexual touching, contain sexually explicit content, or are cataloged as sex instruction for children and teens are removed from library stacks and from the online library system, and that all funding for these materials are withdrawn. If there's no way to restrict the allocation of the funds, I ask that all funds are withdrawn until City Council is assured that these books are removed and no future acquisitions are permitted. In the Executive Policy Committee meeting on March 16th, Mayor Gillingham and City Councillors demanded decorum as they opposed to the reading of an excerpt from literature catalog for minors. Meanwhile, these books are available in the Winnipeg Library System and promoted to minors. If this literature is offensive or undignified or obscene, why should minors be subjected to it? Since Winnipeg libraries lack the protocol to ensure parents can screen library materials for any of the explicit sexual content mentioned above, and that which the Mayor of Winnipeg and City Council finds offensive, the lack of protocol contravenes parental human rights. In addition, it is a violation of the criminal code to make these books readily available. I was surprised that I had to write this speech to remind City Council members that good intentions are not enough to prevent the atrocities that a violation of human rights can precipitate. The system of residential schools established in Canada dates to the Indian Act of 1876. The decision was taken to separate First Nations children from their parents and move them to live in residential schools. The intention was to isolate Indigenous children from the influence of their own native culture and religion to assimilate them into the dominant Canadian culture. However diabolical it may appear today, the intention was likely considered noble to the authorities at the time. Perhaps the authorities felt they were acting in the best interests of the children for the greater good, that assimilation was even desirable at the risk of unintended consequences. Through the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, we now know the continued toll residential schools have had on generations of First Nations people alive today. Human rights have been written into the law at the international, national, and regional levels, lest we forget the barbarism of human rights violations in our past. A Human Rights Museum of international acclaim was conceived, planned, and erected in our own city of Winnipeg. It serves as a testament to the brutality of dogmatic thinking and genocide with the aim of creating awareness and preventing future carnage. Among the international human rights laws that Canada shares, almost every country in the world has signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child. Canada signed the convention in 1991, committing to protect and promote these rights. In Article 5 of the Convention, it says, governments and government actors, quote, shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents to provide in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child appropriate direction and guidance. Paraphrasing, governments and government entities should respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents to provide age-appropriate parenting. To respect means that governments and government actors should not interfere with parenting. Not only are there fundamental human rights that defend parents as the primary educator of children, but there are also criminal laws in Canada that protect children. Regarding libraries, children are not always accompanied by a parent in libraries. Libraries are assumed to be safe places for children to roam freely amongst the book stacks. By age 12, I visited local libraries unsupervised. There was trust that children's materials would be age appropriate. Sadly, that degree of trust cannot be extended to Winnipeg libraries today. In the absence of parental supervision of children in the public libraries, children are being tasked with self-parenting without the requisite knowledge of the potential harm age-inappropriate literature and images can have on their healthy development. Library boards approach with requests like mine have defended the access and promotion of undignified works like these, quoting the principles laid down by the Library Association on Intellectual Freedom, which states, quote, it is the responsibility of libraries to guarantee and facilitate access to all expressions of knowledge, including those which some elements of society may consider to be unconventional, unpopular, or unacceptable. First, I'd like to address the claim of knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong, but books like these were not promoted to minors in the children's section of our libraries prior to 10 years ago. What knowledge emerged between then and now that reassures parents that children are safe with the sexual explicit content we are finding in children's books in libraries today? The scientific method is precautionary and requires evidence to challenge status quo beliefs. Without evidence to demonstrate safety, there's no justification for altering the status quo. So where is the evidence-based research that supports exposing our children to materials that we were never exposed to ourselves? What are the benefits and what are the risks? Knowledge is defined as the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. What knowledge is being conveyed in books that are cataloged as sex instruction for minors when these works lack information on limits of the law, that age of consent to sexual activity is 16 in Canada? What knowledge is being conveyed without mitigating the unintended consequences of exposing minors to these materials without parental supervision? As a trained health economist and professor of research, I felt compelled to conduct an informal search of scholarly literature on the topic of children and sexually explicit content. Most notably, I found that several agencies and independent researchers in Australia had recently studied the impact of pornography on children in a comprehensive way. This included the work of Professor Michael Flood that I consider particularly impressive and relevant. He is a sociology professor at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia, specializing in gender, sexuality, and interpersonal violence. He has authored over 40 journal articles, 29 book chapters, and 80 other publications. I consider him an expert, so I wrote him to ask about my concerns regarding the books that I want removed. He responded saying, quote, "A key distinction to make here is between age-appropriate and inappropriate materials on bodies and sexuality for children and young people. Children and young people should have access to age-appropriate materials on bodies and sexuality, but yes, from what you've described, these materials don't sound at all appropriate because of A, their degree of sexual explicitness, and B, the endorsement of some forms of sexual activity among children." He then provided me 2 lists of references he has made available on his website that include peer-reviewed scientific publications from a multitude of other international experts under the titles 1, Sexualization of Children and Young People, providing 40 references, and 2, Pornography Exposure Among Children and Young People, with over 200 references. As I mentioned, the lists are publicly available if you're interested in seeing them. Permit me to read a few excerpts from recent works on the impact of child exposure to sexually explicit material. I'll begin with Tenner and Associates in 2022 published an article entitled, "You Can Really Be Hurt by Someone Just Like You, Practitioners' Perceptions of Pre-Adolescent Peer Sexual Abuse." And they state, offensive sexual behaviors were explained by many participants by the absence of an adult who could identify and mediate normative sexual needs, as well as mediate exposure to inappropriate sexual content such as pornography. Also, Massey and Associates write, in 2021, young people's sexuality is affected by sexual imagery, and that this influences children and young people's sexual attitudes and behaviors. The impact is contingent on the young person's support network, social learning, and other demographic factors. I'll give you one more, but I encourage you to look at the other works that I've attached to this document. Flood in 2009 concludes, while children and young people are sexual beings and deserve age-appropriate materials on sex and sexuality, pornography is a poor and indeed dangerous sex educator. Respecting the limits of time in making this address to you, I must leave you to look into this information and think about what this body of research says about at-risk minors that do not live in a supportive environment but are exposed to pornographic materials. From this sample, we have seen that the higher the degree of sexual explicitness and the absence of a parent or guardian appear to be detrimental to children who consume sexually explicit content. It is a parent's right and their responsibility to educate their children on sex. Who else would be qualified to instruct children on sex, and who would be responsible enough to take precautions with exposing them to dangerous content? Consider the authors of these books critically. For example, the Winnipeg Library System has copies of the book entitled Let's Talk About It, The Teen's Guide to Sex, Relationships, and Being a Human. It's cataloged as Sex Instruction for Children. It's authored by Erica Moen and Matthew Nolan. Who are these people with the expertise to write a teen's guide to sex? What is their specialty to qualify them to write and illustrate such a treatise? If you search for the first author's bibliography, Erica Moen is not trained as a teacher, a guidance counselor, a psychologist, or a sex therapist. In fact, she is a comic book artist, and her husband, Matthew Nolan, is also a comic book artist. There are no other authors listed on the work. How is this appropriate? Please do your due diligence and look at this book. The book is sexually explicit. And ask yourself, who is qualified to instruct your minor children and grandchildren on sex? As delicate as this issue is, unprecedented in our history, while research continues to be underway to investigate the impact of obscene and sexually explicit images on children, how can anyone justify that a comic book artist is going to provide a teen's guide to sex in Winnipeg when they are not qualified by any professional standard, and while it is illegal for minors to engage in sexual activity anyways? I must leave it to you to explore the level of expertise of the authors of books listed as sex instruction for children and teens by searching the online library catalog. Returning to the quote of the Canadian Library Association on intellectual freedom, it's not that I consider these books unconventional, unpopular, or unacceptable. I consider the distribution of these books a violation of the fundamental human rights of the parent, the rights of the child, and a criminal act. In the same way that today we acknowledge that First Nations parents were criminally removed from all decision-making power over their children during the decades of residential schools, I'm signaling to you that parental rights are under threat again. Unbeknownst to many parents, governing entities are making decisions for children regardless of the input or desires of parents, with the mindset that they, the governing bodies, know better. Safeguards have been put in place in our laws to protect children from sexual counseling, sexual touching, and from distribution of images of children performing sex acts. But we are witnessing in real time public libraries making a choice to distribute highly sexualized content for children that contravenes the law and ignores parental rights. They do so in the name of expression of knowledge. However, this expression of knowledge does not supersede the rights of a parent, the rights of a child, nor the Criminal Code of Canada. I appeal to you to stop using tax dollars for funding that places our children in harm's way. From what I've heard at the meeting on Thursday, those funds could be better allocated by the libraries in more effective and positive ways.